On today's video, I'm going to be replacing a clutch on a Stihl MS-192 top handle chainsaw. The reason I'm replacing the clutch is the chain keeps rotating when the saw is at idle. I've already adjusted the carburetor and it's not a carburetor related issue. The springs aren't contracting properly on the clutch, which is grabbing onto the sprocket, causing the running while it's at idle. You can also replace the springs on this particular clutch. There was a lot of wear, so I just opted to replace the entire clutch assembly. I'm going to show you guys in this video in under a couple minutes how you can replace the clutch on your Stihl MS-192 chainsaw. In order to do this repair, you're going to need two simple parts. The first one is a piston stop, and the second one is going to be a 13mm socket. Depending on how long the clutch has been on the unit, sometimes they're hard to get off. You can use a socket and a breaker bar, sometimes those will pop, but personally, I prefer to use an impact. This is a Menards Special. The reason I use a Menards Special, because it has low torque. If you use the cheap impacts, they work great for doing this kind of work so you're not damaging stuff. I have Milwaukee equipment in here that I use if I really need to get it out, but I prefer to use the Menards Special. Like I said, it's just not super great on torque, but it's just enough to be able to pry those free. On this particular chainsaw, the clutch is going to come off clockwise. Almost all chainsaws, trimmers, and blowers are going to be the same way, but make sure you guys are checking the manufacturer's recommendations. Also look on the clutches. A lot of times they'll have an arrow pointing clockwise. That's going to show you how you need to remove it. Another thing to keep in mind is when you're blocking off the top of the piston, if you're using a piston stop piece of rope, make sure that you guys insert it and then you rotate the clutch clockwise so that way it pushes up the piston to the top of the wall. If you guys leave a gap in there and you try to impact it, anytime you're using a piston stop, you could poke a hole in the top of the piston. So make sure that you guys are making sure that you're getting any gap out of there and it's nice and tight before you try to impact it off. So with that, we're going to jump right into the video. I'm going to show you guys how to remove this clutch and get a new one installed. Start by removing the air filter cover as well as the air filter so that way you can remove the ignition coil from the spark plug. On this particular design, there's not a lot of room, so it just makes it easier when you have all that stuff out of the way. Go ahead and remove the spark plug so you can install the piston stop. You have to have a piston stop or piece of rope so that way you can secure the piston in order to take off the clutch. Notice how I'm holding the piston stop and rotating the clutch to remove any of the gap. This is going to take a 13mm socket. We're going to be going clockwise in order to remove the clutch. Now that I got everything tight, make sure that you hold the piston stop in place while you're doing the impacting, otherwise it could fly out. I barely had to use any force to get this clutch off. Now I'm going to inspect the sprocket, the needle cage, and the worm gear as well as the oiler. It just makes sense to inspect the stuff and clean it out while I got everything apart. There's some debris as well as a little bit of melted plastic on the worm gear. I'm going to go ahead and pry that off so everything's nice and clean. Now I'm going to pull the worm gear, I'm going to inspect it, and I'm also going to take a look at the oil pump and blow it out to make sure everything's nice and clean. Before I reinstall the needle cage, I'm going to put a little of this multi-lube grease on there so that way it's lubricated properly. You can use any high temperature grease that you have on hand. Make sure you install your clutch with the nut facing out so that way you have something to grab on with your socket. It will install either way, but you don't want the nut going on the inside towards the sprocket. Once you got it hand tight, re-secure your piston stop and then go ahead and impact it on the rest of the way. I just get it on slightly with the impact and then I'll go back and check with the torque wrench to make sure it's at the right specs. Do not over tighten with the impact as you could damage the piston. Make sure that you guys are going back and double checking with the torque wrench. Once you have the proper torque, go ahead and remove the piston stop and reinstall your spark plug. If you guys found that video helpful in taking off your clutch, make sure you guys like the video and subscribe to my channel. I've got lots of other great content on there of repairs that I do in the shop on a daily basis.